53% of adults over 50 report a persistent low-grade sense that their life has not added up to what it was supposed to. Not depression, clinically distinct from it, but something quieter and more specific. The feeling of having followed the instructions and arrived somewhere wrong. The American Psychological Association's 2023 Stress in America survey found that adults aged 45 to 64 scored higher on measures of chronic unmet expectation than any other demographic, including teenagers. Higher than teenagers. A 2021 study published in Developmental Psychology by University of California, Davis researcher Amber Kerr found that the cohort now entering their 50s, born roughly between 1965 and 1975, reports the sharpest gap between anticipated life outcomes and actual life outcomes of any cohort tracked since longitudinal life satisfaction research began in the 1950s. The gap is not about poverty. Median household income for this group is $74,000. They are statistically comfortable. The gap is between what they were told the accumulation of correct decisions would produce and what those decisions actually produced. A 2022 Gallup poll found that 61% of Americans in this age range described themselves as having followed the expected path: education, career, family, home, and 48% of that subgroup described feeling, on balance, that the path had not delivered. That is roughly 31 million people who did what they were told and are now sitting quietly with the arithmetic that doesn't work. The numbers are not describing a personal failure. They are describing a structural one. The phenomenon has a name in developmental psychology, though almost nobody outside the field uses it. Susan Krauss-Whitbourne at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, one of the leading researchers in adult identity development, has spent 4 decades documenting what she calls identity accommodation, the process by which adults, rather than updating their self-concept when reality fails to match expectation, instead absorb the discrepancy silently and file it as personal inadequacy. The person doesn't conclude that the model was wrong. The person concludes that they were insufficient to the model. This is not a pathology. It is, Whitbourne's research suggests, the default cognitive response for adults who were raised in environments that presented the life script as meritocratic, linear, and essentially reliable. Which is to say, almost everyone who grew up in the postwar Western world and its cultural inheritance. The postwar promise, education plus effort plus compliance, equals a specific and satisfying life, was not invented by accident. It was constructed, deliberately and with significant institutional investment, between roughly 1945 and 1980. Robert Gordon, the Northwestern University economist whose 2016 work The Rise and Fall of American Growth documents this period in exhaustive detail, shows that the economic conditions between 1945 and 1973 were genuinely anomalous by any historical standard. Real wages rose steadily for 3 consecutive decades. A single income reliably supported a household. A pension was a reasonable expectation. College was affordable relative to earnings. The script was not a lie during the period when it was written. It was an accurate description of conditions that happened to exist for one specific window in one specific country, during one specific alignment of post-industrial economic forces that had never existed before and have not existed since. What happened is that the script outlived the conditions that made it true. The people now in their 50s were handed a map drawn for a terrain that had already begun to change by the time they were old enough to use it. Subscribe if this is the kind of script that doesn't let you look away. The specific mechanics of that change are worth naming precisely, because the failure to name them is exactly what allows the discrepancy to be experienced as personal rather than structural. Between 1979 and 2022, real wages for non-supervisory workers in the United States rose by approximately 8% across 4 decades, adjusted for inflation. In the same period, housing costs relative to median income doubled. College tuition at 4-year public universities increased by 213% in inflation-adjusted terms, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. Pension coverage among private sector workers fell from 38% in 1979 to 13% in 2022. The script said, "Work hard, save, and retire with stability." The underlying infrastructure that made that sentence true was being systematically disassembled during the exact decades the current 50-year-olds were executing the script. They were doing the right thing in the right order in a building that was quietly losing its load-bearing walls. There is a particular cruelty in the timing. The people now aged 45 to 60 were socialized during the 1970s and 1980s, when the postwar optimism still dominated the cultural narrative even as the economic foundations beneath it were already eroding. They absorbed the promise during childhood and adolescence, the period when identity and expectation are most malleable and most durable, and then spent their adulthood discovering, gradually and without a clean moment of revelation, that the promise was no longer operative. There was never a day when someone said, "The contract has changed." The gap was revealed in increments. A pension that wasn't there. A career plateau that arrived earlier than expected. A home equity that didn't grow the way a parent's had. A retirement account that was supposed to supplement Social Security and is now supposed to replace it. Each disappointment arrived alone, which meant each one could be absorbed as a personal setback, rather than recognized as evidence of a systemic shift. This is not speculation. It is documented in cohort comparison data. The Health and Retirement Study, run longitudinally by the University of Michigan since 1992, tracks the same individuals across decades, measuring wealth, health, and self-reported life satisfaction against expectation. The cohort that entered the study in its early waves, the so-called silent generation and early boomers, largely met or exceeded their own economic expectations by retirement. The cohort now approaching retirement age is running consistently below their self-reported expectations on wealth accumulation, housing security, and retirement readiness, despite having made more correct choices by conventional metrics. More education, more dual-income households, more financial planning. More correct choices. Worse outcomes relative to expectation. The gap is not explained by behavior. It is explained by the economic environment in which that behavior took place. And yet the internal experience is one of personal failure. That is the mechanism Whitbourne identified, and it is the mechanism that makes this specific to this cohort in this specific way. If a person is told from childhood that outcomes are proportional to effort and choices, and they make the effort and the choices and the outcomes don't arrive, the only available explanations are two. Either the model was wrong or the person was insufficient. The model was authoritative, institutional, parental, cultural. The person is just one data point. The asymmetry of authority makes the second conclusion feel more credible than the first, even when the first is obviously correct. Even when the data is as clear as it is. There is a 2019 study from researchers at Stanford Center on Longevity, specifically Laura Carstensen, whose work on age-related motivation and emotional regulation is among the most cited in the field, that found that adults in their late 40s and 50s who experience what she calls biographical disruption, the recognition that the life narrative isn't tracking the expected arc, are significantly more likely to attribute that disruption to internal rather than external causes. Not because they are wrong about the facts, but because the internal attribution is less cognitively destabilizing. Blaming yourself is, in a specific and measurable way, less frightening than confronting the possibility that the systems you organized your life around were unreliable. Self-blame is a form of control. If the failure is yours, the future is still theoretically fixable. If the failure is structural, the future requires a different kind of reckoning entirely. Subscribe. The next section is where it gets specific. This cohort also faces something no prior generation had to confront in quite the same form. The simultaneous visibility of everyone else's curated success. Sociologist Sherry Tuchel at MIT, whose work on technology and identity spans 4 decades, has documented the specific damage done by the current information environment to adults who are already engaged in the work of life assessment. The social comparison theory, originally articulated by Leon Festinger in 1954, holds that humans evaluate their own status and achievement primarily by comparing themselves to others. For most of human history, that comparison set was local neighbors, colleagues, people in physical proximity whose actual lives were more or less observable. Social media has not expanded the comparison set. It has replaced it with a curated performance of the comparison set, filtered for upward trajectory, professional achievement, and visible fulfillment. The 50-year-old doing honest life inventory is now doing it against a reference class that doesn't actually exist. The comparison is not with real people. It is with the optimized self-presentation of real people, which is a fundamentally different and considerably more punishing benchmark. The clinical literature on this is growing. A 2022 meta-analysis published in Computers and Human Behavior examining 73 studies across 17 countries found that passive social media consumption, scrolling without posting, was specifically associated with increased retrospective self-evaluation in adults over 45. Not anxiety about the future. Reassessment of the past. The specific experience of looking back at a life already lived and finding it, by some operative standards, short. That is a distinct psychological event, and it is being produced in statistically documentable quantities by a technology that did not exist when these people were young enough to have adjusted their expectations. Here is the thing the clinical literature tends not to say directly. The feeling is, by some measures, rational. Not irrational. Rational. The expectation was set. The conditions changed without announcement. The person executed the plan and the plan did not produce the advertised outcome. The feeling of failure is a correct read of the gap between input and output. The error is not in the feeling. The error is in the attribution, in locating the source of the gap in the person rather than in the machinery. That distinction matters not because it produces comfort, but because it changes the object of analysis. The question is not what did this person do wrong? The question is what did the promise get wrong? And when did it get wrong? And who kept repeating it after it was no longer true? Researchers at the University of Zurich published a 2020 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology examining what they called normative life scripts, the internalized timelines most adults carry for when major milestones should occur. The study found that these scripts are remarkably consistent across demographic groups within a given cultural context, and remarkably resistant to updating, even when personal experience contradicts them repeatedly. A person who has not met the script's timeline for a particular milestone by the expected age doesn't typically revise the script. They revise their self-assessment. The script stays fixed. The person moves into deficit. The midlife crisis, that reliable cultural shorthand for the 50-year-old in a sports car, has been gradually retired from serious psychological literature as a concept, not because it described nothing real, but because it described a surface phenomenon while obscuring a more specific and more interesting one. The crisis is not about aging. It is about accounting. It is the moment when the distance between the projected life and the actual life becomes too large to manage through incremental self-blame, and can no longer be deferred. The sports car is not a symptom of vanity. It is a visible notation in a ledger that a person has been keeping privately for 20 years. This is worth staying with. The demographic that is experiencing this most acutely is not the wealthiest or the poorest. The research is consistent on this point. Psychologist Daniel Mroczek at Northwestern University, analyzing longitudinal data from multiple cohort studies, found that life satisfaction in late midlife shows a U-curve pattern. It tends to decline in the late 40s and early 50s before recovering in the 60s, but the depth of the trough is not predicted by income or educational attainment at the high end of the income distribution. It is predicted by the size of the gap between expected and actual outcomes. The higher the expectation, the deeper the trough. The most educated, most deliberately planned cohort is experiencing the greatest discrepancy because they had the most precisely articulated expectations and the most explicit cultural promise that those expectations were achievable. They followed the most detailed map. The map was the most wrong. If you've made it this far, subscribe. The rest of this matters. There is one additional variable that the standard narrative around midlife dissatisfaction consistently underweights: the role of identity investment in career. In a 2018 paper published in Work, Employment and Society, researchers Allison Pugh at the University of Virginia and colleagues documented what Pugh calls the one-way honor system, the implicit compact in which workers are socialized to give total commitment and identity investment to careers that are structurally incapable of reciprocating that investment. The 50-year-old who built their identity around a career that was downsized, automated, or simply plateaued earlier than expected is not experiencing a professional disappointment. They are experiencing an identity crisis because the career was never just a career. It was the primary mechanism by which a generation was told they would become legible to themselves and to others. When the mechanism fails, the self it was supposed to produce is the thing that feels absent. The feeling of failure at 50 is, in this analysis, not the feeling that outcomes are insufficient. It is the feeling that the self is somehow incomplete, that the person they were supposed to become did not fully arrive. That sentence does not appear in the clinical literature in quite that form. It should. The complication, and there is always one, is that the research also shows that this is not the end of the story. Erik Erikson's 8th stage of psychosocial development, generativity versus stagnation, which Erikson positioned as the central developmental task of midlife, describes precisely this reckoning, the confrontation between a person's constructed narrative of their life and the actual facts of it. What Erikson's later interpreters, particularly Dan McAdams at Northwestern, have documented is that adults who successfully work through this reckoning, not by resolving it, but by reconstructing their personal narrative to accommodate the gap rather than hide it, report significantly higher measures of purpose and coherence in later life than those who don't. The reckoning is not a terminus. It is a process, but it requires naming what is actually happening, which is exactly what the cultural framing around midlife has historically prevented. The data does not resolve into comfort. That is not what it is for. What it shows is a specific generation, socialized on a specific promise, executing that promise faithfully, in an economic and social environment that had already stopped honoring it, now sitting with a discrepancy they were never given the language to name accurately. 31 million people doing math that doesn't add up, privately, in the specific silence that follows the discovery that the instructions were for a different problem. The question the data leaves open, the one nobody has answered cleanly, is whether the cohort behind them watching this will be handed a different map, or the same one with better graphics. The numbers are already coming in on that question. They are not reassuring. If you want more videos like this,